The Russian commanders were aware that, if used correctly, their battleship formations could overpower the Japanese threat. But before they could arrange their ships into an effective attack formation, several Japanese battleships suddenly emerged from the mist and opened fire simultaneously, throwing the Russian fleet into chaos. This dramatic moment marks the beginning of one of the most important naval confrontations in history, a battle that took place during the Russo-Japanese War and is known as the Battle of Tsushima. The roots of this conflict stretch back to the year 1904, when tensions between the Russian Empire and Japan were steadily escalating. Driven by the same motivations that continue to fuel conflicts between major powers even today: dominance, prestige, and regional influence. Both empires sought to expand their control and secure strategic advantages in East Asia. Japan's primary objective was Korea, a territory geographically close to the Japanese mainland. Japanese leaders believed that if they failed to establish dominance over Korea, another foreign power would inevitably step in, turning the peninsula into a launching ground for future attacks against Japan. This fear of encirclement and vulnerability mirrors modern geopolitical anxieties, where nations often justify expansion or intervention by citing security concerns over neighboring regions. Russia, however, viewed Japan's ambitions in Korea as a direct threat to its own strategic goals. Despite being a vast empire with extensive coastlines, Russia faced a significant disadvantage. Most of its major ports froze during the winter months, severely limiting naval operations. Any overseas military intervention required waiting for ice to melt, which was both impractical and strategically dangerous. As a result, Russia was desperate to secure warm water ports that could operate year-round. This ambition became even more pressing after Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War roughly a decade earlier. Following that war, Japan gained control of the Liaodong Peninsula, which included Port Arthur, a highly valuable warm-water harbor. Russia had long coveted Port Arthur, and Japan's acquisition of it alarmed Russian leadership. In response, Russia sought support from European powers, and together with Germany and France, it pressured Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China in what became known as the Triple Intervention. Although Japan had won the territory through warfare, the combined pressure of these powerful European nations forced Japan to relinquish control, a deeply humiliating experience that left a lasting bitterness within the Japanese political and military establishment. What followed only intensified this resentment. After Japan returned the peninsula, Russia negotiated directly with China and leased Port Arthur for itself, effectively achieving through diplomacy what Japan had been forced to abandon. Russia then began transforming Port Arthur into a major naval base, strengthening its presence in East Asia and securing the warm water port it so desperately needed. To Japan, this move felt like a betrayal and a calculated insult, fueling anti-Russian sentiment across the country. Tensions escalated further during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. When several foreign powers, including Russia, sent troops into China to suppress the uprising. Russia used the rebellion as a pretext to move large numbers of troops into Manchuria, claiming logistical necessity due to the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Once the rebellion was crushed, Russia refused to withdraw its forces, effectively establishing a permanent military presence in a region alarmingly close to Japan. Japanese leaders watched with growing concern as Russia strengthened its grip on Manchuria, fortified Port Arthur, and rushed to complete the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would allow rapid deployment of Russian troops from Europe to East Asia. Japan attempted to resolve the crisis diplomatically, proposing a compromise in which Japan would dominate Korea while Russia retained influence over Manchuria. But Russian responses were slow, dismissive, and vague. To Japanese leaders, this delay appeared intentional, a stalling tactic that allowed Russia to continue its military buildup. Convinced that time was working against them, Japan concluded that war was inevitable and that striking first was the only viable option. Although Russian leadership was aware of rising tensions, Tsar Nicholas II instructed his commanders at Port Arthur not to initiate hostilities, believing that Japan's relatively young navy would pose little threat to the might of the Russian Empire. This underestimation proved catastrophic. On the night of February 4, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats launched a surprise attack on Russian ships anchored at Port Arthur, damaging several vessels before Russia had officially declared war. Japan formally declared war 6 days later, but by then, the strategic initiative was already firmly in Japanese hands. Russia now faced a severe logistical challenge. Its naval forces in the Far East were split between Port Arthur and Vladivostok, separated by great distances, making coordination difficult. Over the next few months, Japanese forces landed troops in Korea and Manchuria, while the Japanese Navy established a blockade around Port Arthur, trapping the Russian fleet inside. By May 1904, Japanese ground forces had surrounded Port Arthur, cutting off escape by land while the naval blockade prevented any breakout by sea. The Russian fleet attempted to break the blockade in August 1904, leading to the Battle of the Yellow Sea. But the effort failed, and the damaged ships retreated back to Port Arthur. Recognizing that the trapped fleet would eventually be destroyed if left unaided, Tsar Nicholas II devised a desperate plan: dispatch a large portion of the Baltic fleet on an extraordinary journey halfway around the world to relieve the Far Eastern forces. This fleet, known as the Second Pacific Squadron, set sail in November 1904, embarking on a voyage that would take months and push both ships and crews to their limits. During the journey, the fleet was split into two groups near Tangier, with some ships taking the shorter route through the Suez Canal and others, including the largest battleships, traveling around the Cape of Good Hope. Political tensions with Britain, Japan's ally, complicated the journey, as British-controlled ports refused to supply Russian ships with coal, forcing them to carry excessive fuel loads that reduced speed and maneuverability. Matters worsened after the Doggerbank incident, in which Russian ships mistakenly fired on British fishing vessels, nearly sparking a separate war with Britain. By January 1905, devastating news reached the Russian fleet. Port Arthur had fallen, and the trapped fleet had surrendered. The original mission was now obsolete, but Russian commanders pressed on, redirecting their course toward Vladivostok. After months at sea, plagued by mechanical failures, exhaustion, and declining morale, the Russian fleet reached the waters near the Korean Strait in May 1905, choosing the Tsushima Strait as the shortest and most direct route. Japanese commanders anticipated this move and prepared meticulously. When the Russian fleet entered the strait on May 26, it initially encountered no resistance, leading to brief optimism among Russian officers. That hope vanished when Japanese scouts spotted the Russian hospital ship's lights and alerted Admiral T.G. Hayachiro. The Japanese fleet quickly mobilized and executed one of the most brilliant naval maneuvers in history, crossing the Russian line in a tactic known as crossing the T, which allowed Japanese ships to bring their full broadsides to bear while limiting the Russians' ability to respond. Japanese advantages proved decisive. Their ships were faster, better maintained, and equipped with advanced range-finding technology that enabled accurate long-range fire. Their shells, filled with highly explosive Shimos powder, ignited devastating fires upon impact, while Russian armor-piercing shells, though powerful, were less effective in the circumstances. Within hours, the Russian fleet's modern Borodino-class battleships were crippled or sunk, including the flagship, where the fleet commander was wounded. Command passed to Admiral Nebagatov, but the outcome was already sealed. As night fell, Japanese torpedo boats launched relentless attacks, and by the morning of May 28, surrounded and outgunned, the remaining Russian ships surrendered. The Battle of Tsushima ended as one of the most one-sided naval victories in history. Russia lost the vast majority of its fleet. Thousands of sailors were killed or captured, and its naval power in the Pacific was effectively annihilated. Japanese losses were minimal, with no major ships destroyed. The victory shocked the world, marking the first time an Asian power had decisively defeated a major European empire in modern warfare. It reshaped global perceptions of military power, accelerated political unrest within Russia, and established Japan as a formidable force on the world stage. The battle also left a lasting legacy in naval strategy, demonstrating the decisive importance of speed, technology, morale, and tactical innovation in modern naval warfare.